Hello and welcome to Season 4, Episode 11 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
We are, of course, reading Alan Ryan's On Politics, a book that discusses political theory from the ancient Greeks to the modern day. Today we are continuing our discussion of the 15th, 16th century here, looking at the Reformation. I don't know why I said it like that. The Reformation. Some interesting stuff. So this is weird. I don't even know what that was completely subconscious. Um,
Well, since this is episode season 4, episode 11, so it's the
yes,
411. So we're giving the 411 on the Reformation. Do you know what a
exactly. And
411 reference is? Do you know what that
I've
reference
I've
is?
heard the phrase. I don't know what the reference is to.
Well, you've heard of 911, the telephone number that's
Yes.
called the emergency service. Well, back in the day, before the internets and stuff,
Mhm.
they had information was you dial 411, you get an operator and ask them questions, and they charge a little fee. So when you're talking about, hey, I'm going to give you the 411, that
Hmm.
goes all the way back to like rotary dial phones, and you call up somebody for information. So we're going
Hmm.
to give them 411 to our listeners about the
It's also
Reformation.
somewhat topical because when this releases tomorrow for us, the 7th of November, it'll be exactly a week after Reformation Day. So it makes me kind of wish that we were a week ahead in the schedule. 'Cause,
What's
October
Reformation Day?
31st, he talks about it in here, October 31st, when Luther nailed the theses to
Oh,
the door.
yes.
That's
Yeah.
Reformation Day.
I didn't. Did he even mention his Reformation Day? Did I
I
miss
don't know if he
that?
mentioned it was Reformation Day, but he mentioned the date at the very least.
That is true. That is true.
That's true. That's true. All right, I guess we should just jump right in and start
Yeah.
talking about what exactly the Reformation was. And Alan Ryan says that the Reformation itself is a loose term. It is hard to find a
Wait a
single.
second. Wait a
Yes,
second. Did you mention that we're following his book? Did you
yes, of
attribute
course.
it to him?
That's
Okay.
part of the introduction of everything. Everybody knows that.
All I could think of was 411. Well, the entire time you were talking in the intro. But go ahead.
I could tell by how you waited like a second to say your name. You couldn't even remember your own name for a second there in the intro. That was good. Um, but anyway, as I was saying, Alan Ryan says the Reformation is a loose term, and it's hard to find a single definable Reformation. But the fact is that before 1500, there was no institutionalized confessional divide among Western European Christians, and after 1550, there were several. So somewhere in that period of 1500 to 1550, that is where the Reformation happened. It may have been multiple events. We can't really pin down one exact thing, but this is the fact of the matter. From 1500 to 1550, there was a huge change. And he says that the impact of new theology on politics was this. The big question of how are we to govern ourselves? That is the defining political theory that arose from this. And so the Reformation occurred due to political hostility towards the papacy from European rulers. The confessional divide was an artifact of and instrumental in accelerating the process by which churches became national churches. So he's saying that the big problem was not really the theology of it. The big thing was the politics of the time, how the actual rulers felt towards the papacy. It wasn't just these theological issues, although they were a big part in moving the process along.
Yeah, it seems to me that the theological differences were almost like frosting on the cake. Like really, it was a political problem. The Catholic Church got too involved in the politics and supporting this person over that person and their own interests. And it's my particular point of view that a lot of the theological issues that are brought up at the time are important, but I think is almost secondary to the corruption and the mismanagement and the politicking of the Pope and his subordinates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he says the decisive factor was the readiness of secular authorities to take control of the religious lives of their own states. So it wasn't just that there were theological differences, it's that these rulers were like, okay, we need to get this out of the hands of the papacy. This is the big problem here.
Right, and
Um,
it makes sense because if you're the king, you're like, why is that idiot telling us how to pray when he's over there doing X, Y, and Z, which that they would know because they'd have sources because
yeah.
they travel in the same circle, so to speak, and they're basically thieves and all that, taking the church money and for their own benefit. So it I think it undermined the legitimacy of it, and the kings are like, well, you and whose army?
Exactly. And the clearest example of this sort of idea of the secular authorities taking control of the religious lives of their states was that of King Henry VIII of England, which I did not know was this complex of a thing. Because I think I was always almost taught that it was just, well, he wanted to divorce and that was kind of it. And he was like, well, it's not allowed in Catholicism, so time to make my new thing. But it was really a whole mess. He was a very pious Catholic. He took Mass 5 times a day, most days, but he wanted an annulment of his marriage, as Catherine of Aragon had provided no male heir. However, the Pope couldn't grant an annulment, as the predecessor to this Pope had granted a dispensation for the marriage in the first place, as Catherine was Henry's dead brother's wife. So the fact that the marriage even exists needed an exception from the Pope, and now he's asking the next Pope to provide another exception, which would kind of go against what the original Pope said. And so the papacy at this time was also politically weak, as the Pope was practically the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V's prisoner after the sack of Rome in 1527. And so because the papacy couldn't really do anything, couldn't really, function at all, Henry therefore declared himself the head of the Church of England, and all the amenable bishops within England gave him the annulment. And this is where we kind of get the Anglican Church. So a whole complicated mess of everything there.
And what I thought of when I first studied this, I think it might have been in grade school, and I knew this already. So maybe I don't know when it was. But anyway, genetically, the father determines the sex of the kid. I think that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I have heard that.
And so, he's blaming his wife, and he wants to annul her. But if he marries somebody else, he's going to have the same problem. It's the sperm that determines the sex of the child.
Well, didn't he have the same problem? Didn't he go through the same thing? Or am I thinking of a different king?
I don't remember what happens after that, because I know she had miscarriages too. But I think she just bore a daughter for him, I think, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, if you only knew genetics, you wouldn't be so upset with her.
Exactly. Exactly.
Could have saved, stopped the creation of the Anglican Church if you just knew science.
That is a shame. That is a big shame. And so then we move into the discussion of Protestantism and antinomianism, which is a big fancy word that we'll get into. And so he says that Protestantism initially involved a turning away from the institutions of all kinds. So once the priestly intercession in securing salvation is denied, the idea of institutional churches is threatened, and political institution go back to arm's length fashion of Augustine's city of God. So what he's saying here is one of the big issues was these priests have these special powers, essentially, at least as the Protestants saw within the Catholic Church. And once they're like, well, why do these people have more power than we do? Why do they have this institutional church? Then once that kind of crumbles, and it's like, well, why do any institutions happen? Why are we, subject to any laws when we are our own Christians and those sorts of things? And so the late 15th century attacks were not theological, but based on a shortage of cash. So at this time, there's a lot of, anger towards Catholics. Catholic monasteries were being raided because, these monarchs.
Yeah, I don't think it was anger towards Catholics, because they're all Catholics within the area. It was anger. Well, it was really they're battling each other, and so they're having to raise money for these incessant wars. And here's this monastery that just has literally like a treasure room for all the assessments or donations or whatever you want to call it that the church had, and they're not having to spend it because they're not going to war. And so I think that's really what the point was, is that they needed the funding.
Yeah.
And then, also you run into, you're just talking about the process of them being illegitimate in the eyes of a lot of the public, which opens up the opportunity to say, why does that priest have all this money when we need it for our troops and that kind of stuff? And then I think what it mentions later in the book about the printing press, when the Bible became more available, it's like, why do I need you to tell me what's in the Bible? I can just read it myself. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, it wasn't like anger at them because they were Catholics. It's anger at them because they had all this money and all these resources, and they were considered special in some fashion. And a lot of people were not happy about that.
Right.
And so the term Protestant then emerged relatively late. Emperor Charles V called a meeting of princes of the Holy Roman Empire in 1529 to reverse the existing policy that local faiths were matter of local decisions. So at this time, you're having a lot of people kind of say, well, we don't need this national or international church, really. We can make these decisions ourselves. So we called this council. And the rulers that he was trying to discipline protested and labeled themselves Protestant. That's where the word Protestant comes from. And they were initially called evangelicals based on the idea that individuals in conscience and the vernacular Bible were sufficient for Christian practice. So it's really just up to you. Can you read the Bible yourself? That's all you need. The faith versus faith and works discussion of Catholicism and Protestantism.
Right.
And so the veneration of the Bible led to a premium on literacy. And so this made close reading and thinking for oneself a big priority. And so the consequences for politics, science, and literature were very massive in that regard, because you have a lot of people, wanting to become more literate, because now it's like, well, you're saying I need to read the Bible myself. I better learn how to read. So
Right.
that was actually a benefit of this whole ordeal, was people were like, time to become literate. We need to actually read the Bible ourselves. And so there's this view that the Christian faith that could be found in Scripture alone, and this undermined the importance of the church as a corporation. He says Protestantism is vulnerable to antinomianism, the view that Christians have no need of the law of the state, of conventional morality, or any other laws, for love of one another is the whole law. So this idea, this antinomianism, we don't need anything above us. We are our own persons. We just need this love of Christians, and we don't need anything else, no governing factors at all. Which
Yeah,
is,
and I think that philosophy, sorry to interrupt, that philosophy is so prevalent, and I don't know that I necessarily disagree with it to a certain degree, but I think that's a prevailing factor in the lack of religious observance, or people that go to church on a regular basis in American society today. Is okay. What makes you guys so special? Why can't I just read the Bible and
Mhm,
pray? And why am I going to church? And especially the Catholic Church, why does a priest get to say and do everything? What's this authority? Where does this authority come from? And it's not necessary. I mean, it is in a way from the Bible, but it's not necessarily in the Bible. When that when an instruction for all of us to be evangelistic, to try to
mhm.
spread the gospel and all that stuff. So I think that's an interesting discussion of that time, and I think the current goes all the way through to today, and I think it's really prevalent today. I think
Yeah.
that's the majority
You have
view of religion.
so many people. I think it's a very common answer. Are you Catholic? Blah 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 blah. It's I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. Is I think what you hear a lot of people saying. I think it's for that exact reason. Is because I don't want to go to church. Why am I have to listen to what anybody else has to say? I could just
Right,
make these decisions for myself.
right. And then the kind of the corollary to that is, how can we all believe the exact same thing? How
Mhm.
can we all believe the same religion when we have our individual interpretations of it? But
Yeah,
that's more of
exactly.
a religious philosophy podcast, I guess. But
Mhm.
that was interesting.
Yeah, and he says that this idea, Alan Ryan says, that this stems from the thought that obedience to externally imposed law cannot secure salvation. So just because you're following the rules does not mean that you're saved. Salvation depends on God's grace and nothing else. So that's really where it stemmed from at this time.
Yeah, and that's revolutionary back then,
Mm-hmm.
because if you think, and they had really difficult lives, short, difficult lives, and if you're thinking, what, my salvation in the hereafter has nothing to do with these people,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, I can disregard their orders, and I could still go to heaven as long as I'm a good person. It's revolutionary, literally.
Yeah.
That's how you could start a revolution, and so politically, it has huge implications when you have a church and state alliance,
Mm-hmm.
uh, over people and ordering them around, and that's the authority. And then all of a sudden, people are like, "Wait a second, I don't even need to follow them to get salvation after this brief, painful ordeal of life."
Mm-hmm. Well, it's especially revolutionary when we're looking at like the political theories that we've been discussing this entire time, because like all of them, with like the exception of Augustine, have been trying to answer the question of like, how does the state make you a good person? How does it get
Right,
you to follow morality and things like that? And so like having the idea that you don't need to follow the law in order to be a good person, or that the law does not make you a good person, is very revolutionary.
right,
Absolutely.
and the same thing, but a different way. That breaking the law doesn't make you a bad person.
Hmm.
That's the opposite of that, which is really saying the same thing. I don't have to follow it to be a good person, and it doesn't make me a bad person to disregard it. I'm not doing what you're telling me to do, and as long as I'm following God's will, maybe God's will is that I don't follow you, and then all of a sudden you get anarchy and mass murder,
Yeah, exactly.
one way or
Uh,
the other, one side or the
yeah.
other. Oh yeah, you're not going to do what I tell you. Not against that wall.
He then goes on to say that a lot of these people believe that inner certainty that you are saved is evidence of that salvation. So if you really just believe that you are saved, then that's evidence essentially. But this led to a lot of issues in that it can be very delusive. It can either be, a product of pride or just simple error. You could just be wrong. You could be very, prideful, or you could just be wrong in this. And this leads to pure antinomianism, where the elect feel so wholly saved that they preach indulgence in sins of the flesh as demonstrations of their saved condition. Like, I'm
Right.
so saved, I can go out and murder somebody and it won't matter because I'm so certain inside that I am saved. And it's like, well, that's what this kind of leads to if you let it go on too far in the wrong direction.
Yeah, if you're doing God's will, then everything you do is God's will. And
Mm-hmm.
that's what leads a lot of the rulers, the kings and all that, emperors, into really bad things
Mm-hmm.
because they're divinely inspired or they are divinity. So how can anything they do be wrong or bad?
Mm-hmm.
And if you push that down at an individual level, it really is our anarchy. It's really
Yeah.
dangerous.
He goes on to say that, like, when this behavior was demonstrated within these states, this behavior that antinomianism justifies, it would really unsettle and unnerve the political authorities. And so Protestant communities, when they were starting to develop, were just as ready as Catholics to enforce order. And he kind of says that they were no worse than the disease that they meant to cure. This idea that, well, we don't need these authorities. And then the authorities, even though they were Protestant themselves, were like, hang on, we need some sort of control here. Everybody's saying we don't even need to follow any laws. And so they started cracking down just as much as the Catholics were in some regards.
That's right. Somebody's got to be in charge, and it could be you.
You also had, along with this antinomianism, millenarianism, which is this idea that if the second coming is imminent, then submission to rulers becomes pointless. And this eventually provoked Martin Luther, who we're going to talk about soon, to outbursts of indignation against those who would challenge all law. So he's kind of, one of the people who inadvertently spurred a lot of these things on. But then he himself was like, hold on, guys, we need to dial it back here. We have to listen to some things. It's not just everything is a free for all.
Yeah, and you get to those doomsday cults, man. There's nothing that can
Mm-hmm.
stop them,
Yeah.
other than death, in one way or the other. That's why they're talking about the millennium. That the second coming is coming, and if the second coming is right around the doorstep, then it's time to repent and make sure everybody else repents too, even if it's at the point of a sword.
Yeah.
And they talk about how some of those sects were just wiped out because they
Mm-hmm.
fought to the death and they got it.
Yeah. I think he makes the comparison like a little bit later of like the what's it called? Was it Jonestown? The
Oh yeah,
Jonestown massacres, where it's like, well, if you're so convinced that the second coming is imminent, then why not drink the Kool-Aid and die? It's a really terrible path that it leads you down if you go too far into it.
I think there, yeah, and I don't know that's a great analogy because I think a lot of people just believed it was just Kool-Aid. I think
Yeah,
it was more
that's
of a
yeah.
mass murder than a mass. I think there was a mass suicide, but there were a fair number of them that participated in that there was really a mass murder. And there are a couple of them that didn't take the Kool-Aid and just acted like they had passed out, and everybody else is dead around them. It's horrible.
Yeah, terrible, terrible, terrible. But then we go into Luther, his life and times, and his theological premises. So he starts off by saying that the facts of Luther's life remain somewhat mysterious due to myths written by and about him. He gave conflicting accounts of his own life due to a powerful sense of how they must have been, of how things must have been when he was young. So at different points in his life, he kind of said, well, it was like this when I was young, and this formed me in this way, and that sort of thing. Then he'd conflict himself later. But we do know that
He
he
had
was.
he had a lot of Joe Biden in him. Well, I did this and I did that, and I was
Top of my class, and
I was the top of my class, and I was a scholarship, and I had three majors, and then they're like, he was at the bottom of his class. He only had one major, and he was not on scholarship. oh, oh yeah. Well, let's see. Yeah, he was just saying he went to a historically black college. He said that over
yeah,
the
I
week.
heard about that.
And I don't. He's
So
such.
weird.
He's been doing that since the 1980s, and I wish people your age and a little
Mhm.
bit older, voters a couple of years. I'm sorry to go off this tangent. I'm going to.
That's all right.
It's like the entire world forgot how much of a lying piece of crap this guy has been his whole life. He for years, his wife was killed in a car accident. Wife and one of the kids,
Yeah.
his first wife. And he has repeatedly said that the guy involved in the accident was a drunk driver, and he wasn't. The guy,
Mm.
it was an accident, and I don't even know if it was the other guy's fault. So this guy not only killed, some people, and I don't know if that guy lived or not. But to defame this poor guy as a drunk driver all those years, and he still does it. It's
Yeah.
crazy,
Yeah.
crazy. And we elected this idiot, and then
That's
people
I
are
mean
like,
that's
"Well,
just looking at it from that guy's perspective or his family's perspective, if he did unfortunately die, it's like the president of the United States is defaming, my father or my son or me, and he's using it as like a political ploy as he's up there in these debates or on
Well,
these interviews. And it's like that's
it
awful.
wasn't it wasn't even just when he's president, when he's vice president, before that when he was
Hmm.
senator. I mean, this has been going on for a long time.
Yeah.
And he lies about everything. I mean, anything and everything, and it's so patently false. I don't know. It's just weird. But anyway, so Luther's a little bit like Joe Biden, a little
Yes.
bit.
Yes. Yes.
And
Back to Luther.
I don't mean to insult Luther so much, but that's what I was thinking. I was like, oh, he's a little bit of a fabulist about his history. I mean, that doesn't disqualify from everything, but if you keep doing it, it's like, my God.
Yeah.
Anyway, go ahead.
Yes, back to Luther. He was born in Eisleben, Saxony in 1483 and died in that same town in 1546. And his parents were abusive, and school was not much better. And so in 1505, he entered the Augustinian monastery of Erfurt to escape his parents. And because he suffered a spiritual crisis in his early 20s and thought that the discipline of monastic life would give him coherence and stability. So on October 31st, 1517, Luther posted his 95 Theses on the door of the castle church at Wittenberg and denounced the scandal of the sale of indulgences to raise money for the construction of St. Peter's Cathedral. And so these were therefore, of course, declared heretical in the insistence that no earthly power, even the Pope, can absolve us from our sins. And the Olden conclusion is that the doctrine of salvation by grace alone. And so that's why they were declared heretical, because he claimed that no earthly power can absolve us of our sins. And he goes on to say that indulgences themselves are kind of a weird thing. They were somewhere between a blessing and a certificate entitling one to remission of their sins. They were believed to purchase a reduction of time to be spent in purgatory. So it's essentially, if you donated enough money, you'd get this little piece of paper, buy one, get one free, essentially, time off in purgatory. You've been blessed by, this pope or this bishop or whatever. Crazy, crazy, outlandish stuff. Like, it's weird to think of like, how that would even happen today without like a massive
Oh,
scandal
yeah.
exactly like this.
Oh, it's very similar to going to confession. So you go to
Mhm.
confession and they tell you, okay, say five Hail Marys and or Our Father, and if it's something really bad, maybe you have to do something to make amends, or
Mhm.
and then you're forgiven, and it's forgiven. So
Yeah.
it's like you never sinned, and because Jesus forgives, and the priest is acting in that capacity under those. So that's really what the indulgences are.
Mhm. That's it.
Yeah, and so that's really the theological basis for it.
Mhm.
And the modern day version, one of my favorite columnists and commentators, Victor Davis Hanson, likens it to all these donations to the left wing causes, the woke indulgences. So if you see, and that's how so many of these guys got away with their sexual predations, is that they were left wing, and so these they were like like Bill Clinton, during the Monica Lewinsky scandal, where he's in a position of power and he's getting sexual favors from an intern.
Mhm.
All the feminists just said, well, he supports our causes, so we're going to support him. And it was just astounding at the time. And so that's what Victor Davis Hanson talks about, it being like indulgences in the modern term. So it's still around. It's just you have to understand that wokeism and leftism is a religion, and so they're giving indulgences to other white people that otherwise were sinners, and they absolve you of it. So, like if you say something racist and you're conservative, you don't have those indulgences. You haven't paid you haven't donated enough to the Democratic Party, and so you don't get those. So it's a theme throughout history. It's just you have to pay attention to what you consider a religion.
I think we actually are, I think that's a great point. But I think we are seeing like almost a bit of a scandal similar to what Luther was talking about with like BLM right now. Because I
Mm,
think we're having a lot of people, even the people who donated, thousands of dollars to this movement. There's a lot of people realizing, they had to release their tax forms, didn't they? The organization, and they found out, okay, where was this money that, was said to be going to this great virtuous cause? Where was it actually going? And they have like mansions and they've bought
yes.
like just property and all sorts of assets with this money. And you look at these communities that they said that they were going to help, and nothing's changed. There's been
They
absolutely
haven't.
no change.
Yeah, the actual Black Lives Matter group has done nothing good. They've
Mhm.
paid themselves huge salaries, their family members huge salaries, and they've bought multiple mansions, gated mansions in predominantly white, very affluent, neighborhoods, which I just think is fantastic. The comedy of that is just fantastic. But and that's why I don't care that those donors, Coca-Cola and all those corporate, they're trying to buy indulgences so that they didn't get protested. Because you remember that during the George Floyd, uh, I guess we're supposed to say he always say the beatified George Floyd. We have to say, he is a modern day saint
Mm.
in this church. If these companies did not give money to Black Lives Matter, they were threatened with being protested and called racist. It wasn't enough. Remember, it wasn't enough just to say, "Hey, this was wrong." You had to do more on a corporate level, or else they were going to come after you. And so for any of them to complain, I think Sharon Osbourne was the most recent one to criticize because she donated to them, and then she had some thing that she said or did in her past or something, and they still came for her, and she was pissed and she wanted her money back. That's not how indulgences work. Sometimes they just don't work out for you. Maybe your sin was too big for the church of the woke. But you're absolutely right. That's exactly what those were, and it just went in their pockets, just like the Catholic Church back then.
Yeah.
There's always in any church, there's always going to be that push pull tug where you have people that give money to the church, and then to tell them that they're still sinners and they're still wrong is going to be tough for any sort of minister, whether it's Catholic or not. If they're really supporting the church, maybe you take that into account because they're doing such a good work for the church and paying necessary bills. But it's just a human nature problem. But this was an institutional system that they had to generate the massive amount of money to build the cathedral, and BLM is the same thing. They're just building their own personal cathedrals.
Yeah. Back to Luther.
Yes.
Yes, at the time of the 95 Theses, he was 34 and was actually ordained a priest in 1507, became a professor of theology in 1511, became district vicar of his order in 1515, and he was heavily overworked and suffered sudden collapses of energy. His lectures were animated by convictions of mankind's utter sinfulness and estrangement from God, which conflicted with his optimism of Aristotelianism and humanist features of his lectures. But nevertheless, Luther really had no need to turn against the church, is what he says, that he was a devout Catholic. He was a professor of the faith, and he was, actively helping people to grow in their faith. But the church really hadn't done anything to slight him personally, if that makes sense. It was just the sin of indulgences that he saw was a problem. He didn't mean to really break from the church. He was just like, this needs to change within the church. But the external provocation of Luther's stand were clear. The indulgences launched under Julius II and Leo X were the really deciding factor there, and Luther's local archbishop was embroiled in the process of indulgences and was bribing agents in Rome so that he was not deposed, and then paying indulgences for the sin of simony. So he was, performing this sin by bribing these people, and then to make up for his sin, he was paying indulgences. So he was just making the steady stream of cash essentially into Rome just so he can remain an archbishop and still feel good about himself, which is crazy, which is just absolute money laundering. I'm pretty sure right there.
Yeah, it was just Jeffrey Epstein level corruption.
Exactly. He goes on to say that defending theses was nothing new. Professors did this a lot. Here are my ideas, attack me, essentially. But what turned this into a revolution was the secular support. Luther's prince, Frederick the Wise, was not wanting to defer to the then 17-year-old Emperor Charles V, and Germany itself was in turmoil. The lesser nobility was suffering economic hardship as their military skills became obsolete. They felt oppressed by the church, by church princes, and the peasants of the impending Peasants' War were behind them. So you had this large section of people in Germany. It wasn't just the elite, but it was a lot of just the everyday people were really upset with the economic state. And Luther and his ideas were useful to Frederick the Wise, this prince, because he could, really, capitalize on this and get a lot of support for what his own issues were. But he says, like you mentioned earlier, the greatest weapon in this was the Gutenberg printing press with movable type. He was able to disseminate literature at previously impossible rates, and the translations of the Bible were very important, along with that idea that everybody should do it for themselves. Luther was also struck by the idea of the justification by faith alone, not works, and not by indulgences. He says faith is given by God. Our role is simply opening ourselves to it if God should give it to us. We must reflect on Christ's sacrifice, and there's a priority of the New Testament over the Old. I'm going to read here from the book on page 331. It says, the danger in emphasizing faith as distinct from the grace by which faith is given to us is that it encourages individuals to rely on their own conviction of salvation as a proof that they are saved. That done, sinning boldly becomes attractive, and antinomianism lurks. One response was that of the more severe Calvinists to emphasize that the conviction itself might be a delusion and a mark of God, or a mark of pride, excuse me. Grace was truly inscrutable. So it's with this idea when you're bringing up these deep theological questions, it's how do you even define grace? How do you know if you have it, and that sort of thing? That was a big issue with this, but we're seeing it's not just Luther's theological ideas that are the basis behind this, but it's all these economic problems. And this Prince Frederick the Wise kind of using those theological ideas to spur his own, solutions to these problems into action, essentially.
Good summary.
Thank you. I guess you have nothing more to add there.
I mean, it's a little bit history and some religion, and then we're going to get into the political theory.
Yes,
right?
Exactly. That is exactly where we're going. We're going into political theory. And in 1520, 14 of the theses were declared heretical, and a papal bull formally excommunicated Luther. And Luther responded to this by making a public bonfire of the bull and other documents, including volumes of canon law, which I think is pretty great. I think that's a good way to respond to excommunication.
I like his style, if nothing else.
Yeah, exactly.
Burn the law.
But 6 months before this, he wrote an address to the Christian nobility of Germany, detailing his ideas of church-state relations. And this is where we start to get into his political ideas. So he thought the sacrament of ordination was irrelevant to Christians' ability to relate to Christ. He believed in this priesthood of all believers. We all require a relationship to Christ in our baptism that gives us the ability and the duty to assist others in finding him. Priests just have a particular vocation to do this. So he's saying, there is some sort of elevated status for priests in that they have a particular vocation, but really their skills or their status here is the same status that we should all have. We are all, have this duty, have this obligation to spread the faith. They just have it a little bit more so, if that makes sense. But they should not be, completely impervious to any criticisms, essentially.
Yeah, I look at it kind of like he's saying that like a carpenter is better at building a cabinet, but you can do it yourself. It just won't look as good. They have a skill, they have the education, they've devoted that's their vocation, and you should listen to them because they may be an expert in the field, but they don't have the ultimate authority to determine whether you're a good person or bad person or moral or not. It's your relationship with God and the faith and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. He goes on to say that there is no distinct spiritual and secular estates for clergy and everyone else. It's not just that the clergy are the spiritual people and everybody else isn't. Everyone belongs to the spiritual estate. He also says that the church was not a body politic that exercised jurisdiction over some parts of life while the state exercised jurisdiction over others. And along with that, canon law itself is not law. We should have these separate, different secular and church estates. He also yearned for the primitive church, but not separation of church and state necessarily. He still believed that the state should work to uphold the church, but that the church itself is not a law-making institution in a way.
Right.
He also said that clerical celibacy was absurd. I think this was just an interesting fact because he married 10 years later and had 6 children. So he proved his own point there.
Just as an aside, it really is. It is goofy that the Catholic Church still has the rule of celibacy, and of course, I have theories about of all that and how it's really degraded the ability to have priests. Number one, I mean, the number of applicants is dramatically lower than it would be otherwise, and then number two, the type of people that are willing to do that are either very pious or they are disturbed, and it's probably a combination of both. It's in some cases, not all of them, but like locally, our archdiocese is closing churches and restructuring everything, and a lot of that just needs to be done. But most of it is done because they don't have enough priests to say mass. Well, there's an easy solution to that. You open it up and let the priests get married, or let married people become priests, and there's no good reason not to do that. I
know that the reasoning is, like, in a way, I mean, this is what I was taught in, high school theology classes. But the reasoning is the priest is essentially married to the church in the same way that Christ was married to the church. So it's like they can't have another relationship because they have the relationship with the church itself. I don't know if that
Yeah,
holds up as a reasoning, but I know that is what the reasoning is.
yeah. There's no good reason. They didn't have a reason. No good reason. My dad, I think I mentioned this to you before. I don't think I mentioned the podcast. My dad had at his parish an Anglican priest that had
Oh,
converted to Catholicism. He had already been married and had kids, and they allowed him to convert, and he was a Catholic priest.
huh.
And he said he was the best priest he ever had. And he said he really enjoyed going to confession to him because he can tell the guy, man, I lost my temper with my wife and this and that. And the guy would be like, I understand. you know, and he said it was like talking to a regular person, that has experienced stuff. And then the people that went through like marriage counseling, there's a marriage program that everybody has to go through as a Catholic, and you're talking to a guy who has taken a vow of celibacy, has never been married. I mean, that's so stupid. And it's just impractical, and it gets you a lot of and it's got to be such a hard life. I mean, it's a hard job to begin with, to be a minister or a priest, dealing
Yeah.
with, I mean, dealing with funerals, dealing with, I mean, my job is a pain because I'm dealing with everybody else's problems. I mean, that's what I'm doing. I'm solving other people's problems, or helping them deal with them. I can only imagine how depressing it is to be a priest, and you don't have a spouse, you know, to rely on to help you.
Yeah. I
Very
mean, I know
lonely,
one of
terrible.
my favorite priests that I've ever met or was at our parish, was the one who was a lawyer beforehand. He didn't go straight into the seminary. He had that, real world experience, and it helped
Right,
him just like in saying his homilies and stuff like that, just in structuring things, but it was also just like he feels more like a normal person,
right,
if that makes sense. I don't mean to like dismiss priests as all being like
right,
weirdos, but like
right,
he just felt
right.
like a guy that you could talk to essentially, and not
Yeah,
like
and
somebody.
and his homilies were closing arguments, and I
Mhm.
talked to him about that too. I mean, it really did structure him as closing arguments. He was a good litigator, so he was a. Well, I don't want to say too much because we don't want to get people to know who he is. Although there's only
Yeah.
so many that are lawyers, but yeah, and well, my current priest was a chemist, and he did that for several years before he went to the seminary. So he had a degree in chemistry,
I would
and
assume if he's a chemist.
that's chemistry. Is that the degree? Anyway, so yeah, I mean, there's a lot of those now because it's hard to get people to go straight from high school into
Mhm.
after that you go into the seminary, for college, and if you do, you do miss a lot of those experiences. But anyway, so we're getting a little far afield,
Yes.
but he's I think he's absolutely right about that. And there's a question of why you're not letting women do it. And you say, well, Jesus was a guy, and they're representing, you know, Jesus, and I guess there's some logic to that, but um, I'm open to that idea too. I'm
Hmm.
not sure why they could be nuns, but they can't be priests. I'm not sure I understand the logic of that either. Now, whether they be good, that's
There you go. There you go.
just a joke. It's just a
Yes.
joke. So, but that's not political. That's more specific to Catholic Church.
Going back to Luther, he assumes that godly rulers would attend to the needs of the faithful, but then that raises the question of whether a ruler is a godly ruler. But he also held the belief that there was only one sword, going back to the two swords doctrine of, who has the secular and the spiritual power. He believed there was only one sword and the earthly ruler wielded it. He defended the tradition of passive disobedience towards unjust ruler and never justified rebellion. We'll get into that a little bit later as well. But he says that the address appealed for the reformation of the church by secular authorities. He observed that the papacy hid behind three lines of defense. The first being that the secular power has no power over the church. The second being that the church alone is the interpreter of scripture. And third, that only a pope can summon a council and give it authority. And so he attacks these 3 points. The first one, he says, is laid waste by the fact that the priesthood of all believers, this idea that everybody is part of the priesthood. So once the unique standing of the church is gone, then the clergy's exemption from the usual legal restraints and duties is gone as well. So this idea that, the secular power is no power of the church, does not make any sense if we're all part of this priesthood. The
Right.
second is inconsistent with the thought that every man ought to read the Bible for himself. Why is the church the sole, interpreter of scripture? We should all be able to read the Bible. And he goes on to say that he did not mean for there to be no church, but he does espouse a vision of a church with only 12 cardinals, a tiny curia, and little infrastructure. So just basically downsizing the church as a whole. And the third point, the idea that only a pope can summon a council and give it authority, is the same thing as insinuating that the church is an earthly potentate who is answerable to nobody. He says Luther's point is that the pope is his own confessor, judge of the faith, and the only judge of righteousness of his own actions, and other rulers answer to God and their conscience. He's saying, why does the pope have this special ability to only answer to himself? That doesn't make any sense. We don't do anything else like this. This should not exist.
I think Luther started to convert me.
You're going to convert to Lutheranism?
No.
No. Okay, that's good. I figured you would not go all
No,
the way
but
there.
I think the Pope needs to be a little bit more humble, and the church needs to just be completely reformed, much like what happened in the Catholic Reformation many years ago.
The Counter Reformation.
Don't you call it the Catholic Reformation?
I say the Counter Reformation because it's a reformation to the Reformation.
Yeah, it's Catholic Reformation.
Yeah, the Counter Reformation.
It's the same thing.
Well, yeah, but it's the Counter Reformation.
No, it's not counter. We're not reforming the Protestants. It was a Catholic Reformation.
No. But it was in counter to their Reformation. We did our own.
No, it wasn't counter to it. We didn't. There was a Reformation.
Everybody that I know in every history class I've ever taken, it has always been called the Counter Reformation. I don't think I've ever heard anyone call it the Catholic Reformation.
Well, you were misinformed. Because it's not counter to it. It's in furtherance.
Yes, it was. It was.
No, it's in furtherance of it. It's a Catholic Reformation. It was a reform of the Catholic Church. It wasn't a counter reformation. It's not like it undid the Reformation, right?
No, but they set out their own reforms.
It's like you have revolutionaries and you have counter revolutionaries. So the counter revolutionaries are fighting the revolutionaries. But the Catholic Reformation is not a counter Reformation. It didn't undo the reforms of the Protestant Reformation.
No, but what happened? What happened was they tried to do their own reforms. We kicked them out, and then we said, "Hey, we have a great idea. We have our own Reformation." So it was counter to their Reformation.
It's not counter. Yes,
it was. We said we don't want your Reformation. We're doing our own. It was counter to their Reformation.
But we didn't undo their Reformation where they split off and did their own thing.
Oh, we kicked them out.
We didn't kick them out. They quit.
No, they didn't mean to. Not at first. We kicked Luther out. He didn't want to leave. We kicked him out. That was our Counter Reformation.
He didn't want to. What do you mean he didn't want to leave?
He just wanted to change it. He wanted to change it, and so he said, "We see your Reformation. We're doing our own." A couple decades later.
Yeah, the Catholic Reformation.
The Counter Reformation, yes. Moving on to On Secular Authority. 3 years after Luther wrote the address, he wrote On Secular Authority, and he begins this by saying that his address had failed in its intention of telling German princes what they should do, and it was now time to tell them what not to do, because these German princes didn't really listen to him in terms of the relations between church and state. He goes on to say that almost everyone has made a mistake about obedience. Princes think that they are entitled to rule as they choose, and the plain man thinks that he must obey. But he says neither of those are correct. He says rulers justify their commands by saying that they are required by the emperor, but they really do not mean it. He points out that if the emperor should move to possess these princes' lands, they would surely resist. And therefore, invoking the emperor and his authority is just an excuse for overtaxing subjects and subjecting them to the tyranny of the church. So this idea of, well, if you like it so much, what if it happened to you? And I think he's exactly right. These princes would not like it if the emperor seized their lands. But he doesn't doubt the need for secular authority at all. He says that the sword must be employed on behalf of earthly justice. It is not only rightly employed by agents of the law, but also by soldiers. So it's not just your judges, your police, but he says soldiers do have the ability to wield the sword of justice. He says Christians are to serve as enforcers as well, which raises the question of how it is permissible to wield the sword if we are taught, resist not evil by Jesus. He then goes into this distinction between Christians and non-Christians. He says true Christians have no need of secular law or the sword. They follow the path of justice for righteousness and suffer evil done to them alone. However, all are tempted to be unrighteous, and therefore the law is rightly imposed on all people. He says, maybe there are
Right.
true Christians, but there's not enough of them. Essentially, we'll never have a population of just true Christians. If we did, maybe we wouldn't have a need for the law. But as of right now, we're all tempted. We need the law to exist.
Yeah, we're not, even true Christians are not don't act as true Christians every day of the week.
Mm-hmm.
And so depending on the day, you may have 30% that aren't acting right. So you better have somebody keeping control of everybody on those off days. I don't want to work out today. Well, you better get in there. Get to the gym. But a lighthearted example. But yeah, I mean, is where he says, they need the law to teach, compel, and urge them to act rightly when if you're not a just person or you're not acting justly on that
Mm-hmm.
particular issue. And that's
Yeah.
true. I think people forget that the criminal code is set up as a moral code. I mean, politically, to bring it back to the politics of it, we've talked about this before. There has to be a moral basis, not necessarily religious, but it has to be a moral basis for most of the criminal code as far as what is right and wrong to do and what are the exceptions to that. When do you have an excuse to do something that would otherwise be prohibited? Because you need to have those rules in civil society that are general rules, no matter what your religious beliefs are or what
Mm-hmm.
your ethical beliefs are. We have to have certain standards that you have to uphold, and it's going to be based upon a moral code, and that's the political side of that discussion he's having here
Mm-hmm.
about okay, how do you justify enforcing the law if God doesn't want you necessarily to avenge people, so to speak, but you have to have a civil authority to maintain order, else it's just chaos and misery.
Yeah. He
And
goes
you
on to
don't even
say
have time to you don't even have time to read the Bible if the axe murderer is banging on your front door. You need the
exactly.
police to come over and kill him.
Yeah, he says if there is a shortage of agents of the law, Christians who can do these jobs must offer their services, as there would be chaos and bloodshed without them. So it's this idea of we're not serving the law in order to punish people or that sort of thing. We're doing it in the sense of we are serving others by using the law, by wielding the sword. It's not just for glory or whatever may have
Yeah,
you.
I was thinking of a scene in the town square where they have like a bunch of convicts about to be hanged, and the mayor comes up on the big dais and says, "Hey, Joe the hangman called in sick today. Is there anybody that can anybody have any experience being the hangman that can help us out?" "Oh yeah, I can do it." "Okay, Jimmy, get up here. You're hangman for a day." "I did it 2 years ago." So Luther would be good with that.
Yes, exactly.
This is your obligation to fill in if the regular people are unavailable.
Mhm. He also argues that coercion has no place in faith, and we have no business following ungodly rulers. The secular law and order is maintained by providing external incentives, but the spiritual law works in the heart by faith, and so therefore it is God's business alone because only He can know our hearts. He also says that secular authorities have no business trying to make us believe anything because they don't really know what we believe ourselves. He says, when wicked rulers do what is right, we must follow them, but if they do wrong, we must refuse to assist them. And he gives this interesting example here. He says, if they require us to deliver up a copy of Luther's New Testament that we have in the house, we must refuse. If they come into our house and seize it, we must not resist. By the same token, rulers must not follow wicked superiors into wicked courses, but must not resist when those superiors behave badly toward them. It is an awkward resting place. So don't help
Mm,
them if they're doing bad, but also don't resist them in a way, which is
right.
really, really iffy middle ground there. He goes on to say that Luther's impact on German politics was considerable, but perhaps not in ways that he intended. He may have been very troubled by an essentially anarchic movement that claimed to have been inspired by him, and so he denounces both active rebels and violent rulers. His religious dissension was a symbol of vitality, but only permissible if we could argue without fighting. He's like, talk it out, guys. We don't need to burn down houses and kill people and those sorts of things. We can accomplish
Mhm.
this in a much, much better way. So that brings us to his theory of resistance, which we were briefly mentioning earlier. He says Luther changed his mind regarding non-resistance. He initially held the belief that all we are permitted is passive disobedience. But in 1529 to 1530, he became an opponent that adhering to this would cause, or became apparent, sorry, he became apparent that adhering to this would cause Protestants to face Catholic enemies with their hands tied behind their backs. So if we're just
Mhm.
passive disobedience while, all of these Protestants are being killed, then, there's not going to be any more Protestants, and we kind of need to do something about that.
Well, and
Um,
that brings up the nonviolence theory, like Gandhi,
mhm,
where the criticism of the nonviolence theory is that you have to have an opponent that can be shamed.
mhm,
When you're strictly nonviolent and passive resistance, that may work with the British Empire in that era, but it would not have worked with the Nazis or Stalin, because the Stalin would have just said, okay. And he just
yeah,
would have murdered all of them, and until they got up and started doing what they're told. And so that there's a practical side of it. There's a moral side of it. Okay, well, should we use force to resist evil orders? Well, is using force, you're going to hurt somebody or might kill somebody? Are you just perpetuating violence and sin? But there's a practical side of it. Well, maybe you have an obligation to fight evil, and how much in that is an obligation, how much is that a right? There's a difference between the right to do it and the obligation to do it, and it has a lot of political implications, especially in revolutionary times when you have a tyrant or an oligarchy that is committing injustice. Okay, what
mhm,
if you just have the theory? Okay, well, I can resist, I can just not participate, or I can, do this passive resistance stuff. But if you have an enemy that will literally storm the gates and kill all of you, that's not going to solve the problem.
mhm,
It'll just wipe out your religion by
yeah.
by surrender.
Yeah, and he says it seems like Luther kind of knew that, and he seems that he knew that he needed a justification for violence in a way, because at
Right,
this
because
time,
he would have experienced it. He would have heard of it, not
yes,
experienced it personally, but there were villages that were wiped out, you know.
yeah, because at this time, the Emperor Charles V proposed to return all of Germany to the Catholic Church by brute force if necessary, and so he's asked several times whether resistance was lawful, but he had kind of dug himself a bit of a hole with his reasonings for other things. Because he said that if the church was declared only a congregation of the faithful, then the Protestants had no forum to declare a ruler a tyrant and depose him. If you agree that the church has no power, how can you come together as a church and declare somebody a tyrant? And his contempt for traditions of natural and canon law led him to not have access to jurisprudential arguments that Charles had become a tyrant. So he'd done away with all the canon law, a lot of the natural law.
Right.
So it's like he didn't have any of that to rely on. And so the conclusion
It
that he
can't
came,
rely on that thing that you burned in a
yeah,
bonfire.
exactly.
They made a point, but it'd be embarrassing if I said they had a point. So let me
I got
find
to
something
dig through the
else.
ashes of this bonfire and find what I burned that I now agree with. So they relied on this idea of self-defense. If the empire attacked his subjects, he was violating the law, and they would be upholding the law and resisting him. The legal argument rested in the idea that the positive law of the empire required princes to resist notorious injustice. The constitution bound prince and subject alike, jure divine, by the law of the divine. And so one might resist unlawful authority in the name of lawful authority. That's where this idea comes from. And so the theory of resistance was therefore opened, and Luther could now employ other arguments. It says the ruler who uses unjust force ceases to be a ruler and is in a position of a private person who is attacking us. And a private person can be resisted by self-defense. The emperor was
I,
the
I
aggressor.
think that, yeah, I think this is an important point. And people miss this now today, but it's like a psychological point too, that the president or the governor or the police officer or whatever, if they attack us, if they're using unjust force, morally or practically or however you want to look at it, they are not, they shouldn't have that immunity or that power to do that. They're just some guy or some woman who is attacking us unlawfully as a private person. They've stepped outside their lawful authority. That's an important distinction to make politically and intellectually, that I think is brilliant on Luther's part to articulate it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. He goes on to say that if the emperor was the aggressor, he was in rebellion against the lawful order and might lawfully be resisted. Because he's acting outside of his bounds, he's essentially acting as a private person. He is not
Correct.
employing his right as an emperor because that's outside of his jurisdiction entirely.
Right.
But then he does go on to say, he does not want ordinary people rising up against the empire, essentially. He confined the right to resist to inferior magistrates, those who had authority under the law initially to make decisions within the empire. So already the princes that were appointed to make legal decisions is, well, they should have the right to resist because they've been in this position of law, essentially, which
Yeah,
is,
but that never gets it done because they're put in that position and they're a lot of times they're beholden to the person above them.
mhm,
So and they're participants in it. So I guess you'd say, well, that's a different scenario because then they're participants and it's just the same group, and now I can resist them. But I think he's trying to avoid the chaos of a revolution because
yeah,
the revolution and then a counter revolution, which actually fights the revolution as
mhm,
opposed to furthers the revolutionary goals.
mhm.
Um, such as like the Catholic Reformation,
The counter
not being a
reformation,
counter Reformation, not being a counter Reformation, but
no, sorry, counter
so
reformation.
when you have a revolution, there's always a counter revolution. Unless the revolution is complete success, but there's always forces
Mhm.
that try to fight you, and so I think that's what he's trying to avoid is that kind of chaos and that murder and that and it's hard once you start a revolution. It unleashes a whirlwind that you can't control, no matter who it is,
Yeah,
and it always ends up in some chaos.
absolutely. He does say kind of the point you were mentioning earlier, about, who has the right to resist. He says that this was a movement towards a more overtly constitutional view of politics. That's this idea of, that authority is held on all terms between the people and the rulers. It's not just they have the authority in them alone. It's that, we gave them that authority. We have authority over them if they overstep their bounds and they come and attack us.
Right, and I like this other point he makes. 343 is summarized where that the people can't give up absolute power to someone else.
Mhm.
That there's always a reservation of a certain amount of authority, personal authority. I mean, he doesn't say it that way, but it's like it's something you can't. It's non-delegable.
Mhm.
That you can't delegate to your ruler or to your government complete and total control over you, and that is an important thing that people should remember in modern America, that especially in the COVID tyranny time, that we didn't delegate that, and no
Mhm.
one can delegate that away. There's certain inherent rights, and we will get to that, I'm sure, in future chapters, that are God-given rights, or just if you don't believe in God, the rights that we all have intrinsically just by being in existence, and they are not delegable. I can't delegate away my right to life, my right to certain uh, personal autonomy.
Mhm.
And so if any government actor acts outside that and tries to take that away, then they're obviously acting unlawfully. They can't say, well, you elected me, now I'm in charge of you. Well,
Yeah.
I didn't give up that power. I can't.
Mhm. Exactly. He then goes on to say that Luther died in 1546 when Protestantism most needed a political theory to sustain it as a church militant. He says Protestantism was being persecuted all over Europe. You had the 30 Years' War in Germany, you had Bloody Mary in England, and there was religious civil war in France. And he says
And she was only
Switzerland.
known as Bloody Mary because she's Catholic. I mean, the Anglicans and the Protestants killed a lot of Catholics too. So that's defamatory. But go ahead.
All right. He does say that Switzerland was one of the only places that was solidly Protestant, and it generated much of Protestant political thinking that we know of today. And that is, of course, where we get Jean Calvin, who was a second generation Protestant and was born 1509 and abandoned the study of law for life as a scholar. And his opinions made France dangerous for him, where he lived at the time. And so he went to Basel, and then he went to Geneva in 1536, was exiled for a period of time, and then went back to Geneva in 1547, where he remained for the last 23 years of his life. But his political views occupy only the last section of his Institutes of the Christian Religion. So he starts this discussion of two governments that mankind is under. He says that he insists that the freedom of the Christian is not a license to dispense with all laws and remodel all institutions. He says the civil government is instituted by God and demands allegiance. So there is still this idea that we are subject to these authorities. It's not just do whatever you want. So he's kind of a little bit more, a step back from that than Calvin was in a way. He says that the first obligation of civil government is to foster and protect external worship of God, defend the pure doctrine and the good condition of the church. So, very much, the state does support the religion, not much of a difference between church and state there. He says that the Christian cannot ignore the demands of the secular government. If the kingdom of God were already here, we would have no need for government, but for now, we need it for peace and to lead us towards righteousness. So, very similar to what Augustine was saying. We need to, this is the middle path, essentially. This is the path that we all must take. These institutions are here for a reason. We have to obey them. So, of course, he does not imply separation of church and state. The church must have the mode of worship fixed by the state, and individuals must be compelled to attend services, and pastors must judge citizens' morals. And so his sort of ideal state that he imagined this political community that exhibited top-down legislative and coercive capacity and conferred authority on a recognized body of intermediate magistrates. So this was inspired by the Spartan constitution in a form modified by what Ulrich Zwingli had achieved in Zurich. Now, this guy was interesting. I had never heard of him before, but it seems absolutely crazy.
I had neither, and you skipped over my favorite part of this, where he had this Michael Servetus burned as a heretic at the gates of Geneva because the guy was denied the doctrine of the Trinity. It's like, oh, it's 3 in 1. Burn him. So he was definitely in favor of forcing people to be believers, or at least to shut up about it. That's I never heard of this Ulrich Zwingli guy either. That's interesting, the stuff that we learned from this. We also skipped I thought it was kind of funny. It just kind of came up as an aside with Martin Luther. I wrote on the side of the book, "What?" with a question mark exclamation when he says, among many of his works make no great contribution to political thinking, among them his denunciation of the Jews. I didn't know anything about that. I was like, what? Where did that come from? But I just thought we should just breeze by that. I wanted to mention that.
And that's actually a good point, because he doesn't just mention that Luther denounced the Jews. He criticized his denunciation of the Jews as not being important enough. He's like, we don't really need to discuss it because it's nothing new. He didn't really say anything new about, how much he hates the Jews. Like, it's just kind of glossed right over it. I'm like, oh, okay. I guess that happened.
Well, he was very creative in his hatred of the Jews. Like, what? I didn't know anything about. I'll have to read up about how much Luther hated the Jews. But
back to Zwingli. He was a Catholic who converted to Luther's view that the Gospels were self-sufficient, and so he led a reform in Zurich and united the governance of church and state in his own hands. He urged the expulsion of Catholicism from other Swiss cantons, which was taken as a declaration of war, and Zwingli was killed in battle in 1531. So he essentially, took over Zurich as both the head of the church and the state, declared war on all of his neighbors, and was then killed in battle. He was also a very big proponent of coercion. He had the leaders of the Anabaptists, or people who opposed infant baptism, drowned. And he saw this as a joke in their manner of death. If you believe that adults should be baptized, I'm going to drown you in a body of water.
Yes. I baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, as they're underneath the water. The Holy Spirit. Is he still breathing? It was brutal back then. I mean, we're talking about how contentious our elections are now, and how politically fraught we are. Well, this is nothing. This is
go back to Switzerland in the 1530s, see a guy burned outside the city gates, and Anabaptists drowned by Zwingli.
I really don't think that children should be baptized. I think you should wait till they're 13. Drown him. It's like, come on, man. I just thought they should know what the faith is before you baptize them. That's all I meant. Death.
Well, he even mentioned
kill him.
The reason that he used this coercive power was because he didn't really have much of a justification for it. Infant baptism is not discussed in the Bible. And so his only solution was kill the leaders of this movement by drowning. Yikes.
And I never thought about the infant baptism about not being supported by the Bible, because I guess it seems like any stories about baptism, John the Baptist, I think it's implied that they're all adults being baptized.
Well, Jesus certainly was, yeah.
Yeah, right. Good thing he didn't live at this guy's time.
Been drowned by Ulrich Zwingli.
You're not baptized? Get under the water.
But
of course, they couldn't get him under the water. They couldn't drown Jesus
because he's walking on top. That's great.
It's like all the water would go down. Push him down further. He's always going to be walking on the water. You push Jesus down, the water's going to go down. You're like in a big bubble. How can we drown this guy? He must be a witch. Burn him.
All
What do you
right.
mean he won't light on fire? This is outrageous.
That's the real reason Jesus was crucified. That was the only form of death that would work. Nothing else stuck.
All right.
Yes, back to the book. Zwingli's vision of a devout republic allowed for Calvin's view that it was the business of a middle layer of constituted authorities to ensure the government didn't become tyrannical. So it's not really the people's power, and it's not really that the person in charge has all of the authority. There's a middle ground there that's like, okay, we need to keep you in check. He also disagreed with Luther's idea of resistance that was founded in self-defense of the individual. If individuals treated policies that they deplored as private offenses, anyone might think himself entitled to assassinate any ruler, and so therefore we must put up with bad rulers. Which I don't necessarily agree with the conclusion that he comes to, but I feel like there is a bit of truth in that. If you're saying if you are attacked by this ruler, you have the right to kill them, then I mean you can kind of construe any policy that you don't like as an attack in
Yeah,
certain respects.
yeah, I guess.
He goes on to say that magistrates may be chosen and that they are accountable to God in that, so that there is still this idea of sort of this divine power in a way. And he says, in terms of mixed governments, the balance of the Spartans is best. He says it's not the business of the private man to debate forms of government, but to live peaceably under the regime it has pleased God to institute for them. So still this
Mm.
idea that God has placed these powers in charge. You just have to live peacefully.
Definitely
He's
an
also,
element of fatalism in a lot of this.
Mhm.
It's like the God fated this to happen, or
Yeah.
he destined it to happen, or
Well, he goes further than that. Calvin does. He says that God may use wicked men as his unwitting tools for ends beyond their imagination. So it's not
right.
just, God is allowing this to happen. It's that God has somewhat of an active role in this. Like there is some sort of, benefit to you for obeying these evil rulers because it's part of what God has in mind, which
Yeah.
I
I,
don't, it doesn't sit well with me at all.
yeah, I've often had problems with that. I always have problems with people that say, "Oh, it's God's will," when like a tragedy happens, like
Yeah.
some child dies, or like I'm always worried about when somebody's little kid wanders away and they find the kid,
Hmm.
and the parents are like, "Oh, thank God saved this child," and I just always feel like a tinge of pain for those parents whose kids didn't live,
Mm,
because they have to think, oh, why didn't God save our child?
yeah.
I mean, like, if God's saving this one, why didn't he save the other one? And so I don't buy a lot of that where, God's acting through wicked people,
Yeah.
doing evil things. And
Yeah.
I just
No.
don't think that's God's plan.
Hmm.
I think that's your plan, and you're not following God's plan.
Hmm.
If he has a predestined plan for any of us, I guess.
Yes. And then
Deep
he
thoughts.
concludes this section on John Calvin by saying that it was up to later Calvinists to create the modern liberal theory of revolution. So they come from Calvin's ideas, but they were very different in many respects. Because
Mhm.
Calvin was very much like Augustine, and that you just have to deal with bad rulers. But we do get the modern
Right.
liberal theory eventually from Calvinists, at least according to Alan Ryan.
Yep.
And then the last section in this chapter was maybe the most entertaining, and
Hmm.
definitely the most absurd out of all of them. There's some crazy stuff because we are talking about the radicals that came out of the Reformation. He says that the extreme wing of Protestantism existed in the form of the Anabaptists, who we mentioned earlier as those who opposed infant baptism. They became pacifist and apolitical, but when they were first sort of forming as a cohesive movement, they were willing to fight at times, and when they did fight, they fought to the death, and it was usually their own death. So they kind of
Hmm.
became martyrs for their own cause, which in a lot of protests is it's hard to stop a protest when you have martyrs kind of leading the charge in that sort of respect.
Right.
Um, and so at this time, you had a lot of economic distress, which provoked the Peasants' War of 1524 to 1526. And at this time, Germany had become a kaleidoscope of states and statelets with great economic tension between them. So peasants wanting relief from oppressive landlords provided, most of those who fought and were killed. He gives the number about 300,000 peasants fought in this war, and upwards of 100,000 of them died. So you had, the 33% fatality rate for people who participated in this war, at least out of the peasants, and that's a crazy amount of people to die in this fighting.
And
Uh,
remember, back then it's hand to hand. That's
mhm,
up close and personal,
yeah.
and it takes people to kill that many people. Just the physical. It's not like you're dropping a bomb on a bunch of
Hmm.
people, killed 20 at a time. I mean, you're slitting throats,
Yeah,
and that's that's not good.
yeah. He also says that Luther gave the Peasants' War its character. He says without a Lutheran Reformation, an insurrection likely would have still happened, but the religious elements suggested that some princes might side with the rebels, and so therefore, undermine the empire's unity. And so, because Luther was thought to have instigated the revolt, he actually ferociously attacked the rebels and held contempt for the Anabaptists. So, kind of this idea that, why are you blaming me for all of this? I did not mean for any of this to happen. I need to
Right.
publicly denounce these people that are either getting murdered or murdering, in the streets of Germany. This is not what I intended at all.
Yes.
And so when he was, attacking the Anabaptists, this prompted Thomas Müntzer to attack Luther. He held an ascending view of authority that stemmed from the community. He believed that he was living in the last days, and church reform was a prefiguring of an apocalyptic transformation. And so again, we have this idea of millenarianism. And so he initially did not imply that insurrection should happen, but he did, bring about a lot of iconoclasm, which was direct action to smash statues and stained glass, to shout down unpopular ministers, and institute a very austere Lord's Supper in place of the traditional Mass. But this led to a lot of suspicion from the authorities who tried to expel these extremists. They're seeing, all these statues destroyed, all of this, unrest. It's like, we need to stop this. And so when they decided, hey, we need to get these extremists out of here, Munzer and his followers then claimed self-defense and then began actual violence in the fighting in the streets, essentially. Essentially a kind of a thing of, well, you started it. We didn't attack anybody. We were just breaking statues, but now you've come after us and tried to kick us out.
Right.
Um, and so the peasants' insurrection was destroyed militarily in May 1525. And at that point, the Anabaptists were focused on the need to institute a republican constitution. And so the nobility was denied hereditary right to govern, and they had no right to impose taxes. They did not, however, propose equalization of property. And there was a claim, essentially, that the radicals were bent on communism and free love and the end of all authority, but this ultimately came from the imagination of their opponents. Was not really true that they believed a lot of these things. They were just looking for a significant change, but not that much radical change. He says that after the defeat, they agreed that their kingdom was not of this world, and that the Christian must separate himself from the world. And so they wrote the Schlechtheim articles that provided some guidelines for a church that could survive oppression. And from there, the Anabaptists split into two groups, since that's where we get the very the pacifist and apolitical roots. Is that, well, I guess ultimately our kingdom is not of this world. We can't really say, we can't really act against what's going on here. And then we have the
Right.
two wings. So the wing led by Michael Sattler espoused radical pacifism. He exhorted his followers to refuse military and political services and service and live as strangers to political and judicial arrangements of society. So essentially, to live outside these social arrangements in a way. The other wing was led by Balthasar Habmeier, and he argued that the Anabaptists could hold office and wield swords, but could not rebel against an appointed ruler. So there's still an element of pacifism there. However, there is an epilogue to this radicalism that was the reign of terror of John of Leyden and Bernhard Knipperdolling in Munster from 1534 to 1535. And this is a crazy story. Munster was an imperial city in Westphalia and was ruled by a prince bishop. And the city had recently turned to Lutheranism at the same time that a group of messianic preachers had arrived looking for converts. So I'm going to read this last paragraph. It's kind of a lengthy section, but I don't know of any way that I can summarize this any better than it is, because
All right.
it's a lot. In January 1534, Bernhard Knipperdolling went over to these Melchiorite missionaries with John Mathis and John Bockelson, or John of Leyden, set out to turn Munster into their vision of the New Jerusalem. The Catholic prince bishop besieged the city, assisted by Philip of Hesse, who was a Lutheran but who could recognize anarchy when he saw it. Within the besieged city, mayhem ruled. Mathis got himself killed by leading a sortie against the besiegers in response to what he took to be the direct tactical instructions of God. John of Leyden took over and eventually proclaimed himself king. Here, for once, the stories about polygamy and communism became true. John took 24 wives, arrayed himself in fine robes, and played out an Old Testament drama as the population gradually starved to death under the siege. Astonishingly, the defenders held out to the bitter end. They drove back the besieging forces in August 1534, and although local uprisings elsewhere failed to take the pressure off them, it was only in June 1535 that the city fell. Even then, it felt a betrayal. The inhabitants were massacred, men, women, and children alike. Nipperdalling and John of Leyden were tortured to death, and the authorities hunted down everyone who could be suspected of complicity in the uprising. The events had a sobering effect on the purveyors of apocalyptic visions that lasted a long time. For the man who began the whole business, Melchior Hoffman, survived it all. He had been thrown in jail in Strasbourg and remained there until he died a decade later. And that is where the chapter ends, with this absolutely absurd story of the siege of Münster, where there was just complete and total chaos within the city. But an entertaining story, nevertheless.
Yeah, it kind of reminded me of Apocalypse Now. Have you ever seen that movie?
I don't think I have.
Oh, it's set in the Vietnam War, and there's like a cult. It's a long story, long winding story of a trip into madness in the Vietnam War. That's not a pleasant movie, but there's basically a cult leader that is deep in the jungles, and anyway, so that's just part of the story. But it's such an interesting story, and you think, how did this even happen? You know, and then men, women, and children get slaughtered at the end. I mean, it's just horrible. I mean, they're starving to death, and this guy's got 24 wives, and it's just like any cult leader. You know, the first thing they do is say, "Well, I need to have more women." You know, it's like, the God has ordained that you all are my wives, not you, not the ugly one. No, not you, the other ones. It's ordained by God. I don't know.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Crazy stuff. Crazy stuff coming out of the Reformation. What did you think overall this chapter and of the Reformation as a whole, as presented here by Alan Ryan?
Yeah, it's always interesting to talk about church history and religious history. It's just there's so many layers to it, and it's so contradictory, and it's so wild. As far as political theory, you just see it's kind of developing over time, trying to figure out, okay, what's the role between religious authorities and moral authorities, or like the spirit world versus the secular world, you know, whether the divinity of the king, you know, the emperor before that, and, you know, Greek gods and all that stuff. What's the role of that religious or moral authority versus a secular authority? So it's just fascinating, and you can see how the practical corruption of different church officials affect the political theories of the time, and you know, just trying to figure out, okay, what's our and it's kind of jarring to see that the theories espoused over and over again, that our job is just to obey. You know, it's God set up the system. God appointed. There's some sort of divine intervention in making this evil person our king, so you should just do what you're told. It's just so foreign to me, and so it's kind of jarring when I see that. But it's fascinating.
Yeah.
What do you think?
No, I really like this chapter. I had very basic, like, surface level knowledge of a lot of the Reformation, and know that, like, this is still, you know, somewhat surface level stuff, because we're not getting into too much in detail. But this was a lot more than I'd ever, you know, looked into about the Reformation. And I really like that, just the amount of, like, conflicting things that were going on at the same time, you know, what really were the motivations for all of these, you know, riots and revolts and everything like that. It's fascinating stuff, and of course, always very well written. But yeah, I can't, I agree with you. I just can't, you know, wrap my mind around, well, these horrible, awful people were put in charge by God. You know, we have to listen to them. I cannot get behind that idea. I don't think I ever will manage to, you know, see how that even remotely works in any circumstance.
Right.
I'm not sure if I 100% agree with Luther's idea that it's, you know, self-defense in a way. I think there's definitely some truth in that, and I think it led to some good theories later on. But I feel like I side with Calvin, though, because I think we are almost seeing some of that today, where it's like, well, if this person gets elected, that is a direct attack on this group of people. You know, we have to rebel against this person who may or may not win, and that sort of thing. I think that's kind of the same place that they're coming from, is that, like, it's self-defense. You know, if we don't, you know, do everything in our power to get this person out of office, or et cetera, then it's going to be the death of these people, and it's, you know, very, very harmful. So I don't think that the reasoning for revolt is self-defense, unless, you know, there's actually something that says we are coming after you and we are going to kill you. Like, I think that's, you know, once it's explicitly self-defense, but I think we need some metrics on what self-defense actually is, because I think anything can be construed in a way that's like, well, this person's coming to get me.
Right. That's a good point. Good point. Yep. You know, I was thinking when I was reading this, if we have another season, it might be interesting to do a history of the Catholic Church
That's true, actually. That'd be
with
a good
some,
one.
some detail, because that's a fascinating story, and I don't know a lot of the details. My dad was a big borderline expert on the history of the Catholic Church.
Hmm.
And one of my few regrets in life, I have, I've made mistakes, but I don't generally regret things. But after he passed, we had a multi-volume set of books that was a history of the Catholic Church, and I never did open them. We
Ah,
donated them to I think I don't know if we donated to the parish or whoever. I don't think they kept it, but
mm.
I should have kept them, but I
That is
just dealing with
very
a lot of other
sad.
stuff.
That
Yeah,
is very sad. You're
so
gonna have to track
maybe
those down. That'll be our books for season 5.
I mean, it was like I don't know how many volumes. It was a
Wow.
big. It was like a set, like the Harvard Classic set. I mean,
Mm.
it was a
Wow.
detailed, and he's read and studied all of them. So it's an interesting subject, and I talked to him about it, but I don't really have the knowledge, and didn't have the knowledge of it then. So that might be an interesting topic for us to think about for
No, that'd be
next.
fun. That'd be great. I don't like how you said if though. I think it's a
Well,
when we do another season.
it's always up to you.
Well, I mean,
I'm
we've been
always,
doing this for almost 2 years now.
yes, I know.
In a little over 2 weeks, it'll be 2 years since our
Nice.
first episode was published. So
Yes.
we've been doing this for a very long time at this point.
Yes.
Yes. All right. Any other thoughts on the Reformation?
No.
No. All right. Well, you can, of course, send us your thoughts about the Reformation if you follow us on Twitter and tweet at us at ULMTD Opinions on Twitter. That's ULMTD Opinions on Twitter. You
Should
look
we
like you
get the
say,
should we get the pay the $8 a month for the blue check mark when Elon finally rolls that out? I'm thinking we need to support him, and the billionaire needs the $8 a month.
yeah.
Maybe. And
Maybe.
he's supposed to be rolling out some stuff so you can monetize things. So maybe we can charge subscriptions.
Yeah, you can look at our tweets because I mean everybody's looking at our tweets already. Like
Well,
we get
I think what he's trying to I may be wrong, but I think he's trying to set it up so that it would be similar to Substack, where you can have subscribers for the content that you tweet about, like like a pass through type thing.
interesting.
Yeah, but
Interesting.
I don't know that for the fact, but I think it was my understanding. Anyway,
Mm,
so
yes. All right. Well, this has been season 4, episode 11 of Unlimited Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
I'm still Mark Bishop.
You presumably always will be.
I don't know. I'm a
You don't
strange
know.
dude.
All right.
But yeah, I think, and he's talking about having more video type stuff. So I think we can end up maybe like hosting it on Twitter or something. Like our
Oh,
that I mean he's talking about trying to integrate it. He's trying to separate it like from YouTube. Like because people will link YouTube videos, and it doesn't make any sense to me that YouTube would monetize the videos for their views. Why wouldn't he have it within Twitter or some sort of affiliated Twitter group?
hmm.
So those commercials that you see before YouTube, or have subscribers to YouTube, you'd have it somehow affiliated with Twitter.
Interesting. Very interesting.
So maybe we'll get in the forefront of that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there we go. We can
yeah.
we can live stream our podcast recordings. People can watch us live as
Oh,
we're recording. We'll have a total of 2 people listening, I'm sure.
well, it'd be you and me.
Exactly.